Today, we're plunging into a topic that maybe on the surface feels a bit old school in our super connected world. The enduring power of geography.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about a flat world, right? Instant communication, global everything. Does the actual map, the mountains, the rivers, does that stuff still dictate our destiny?
It's a really critical question.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely yes.
Okay.
We're going to explore how the physical shape of our world, those mountains, rivers, oceans, plains we just mentioned, they aren't just pretty backdrops. They're active, they're persistent forces. They shape history, politics, even future conflicts.
So our mission for you, the listener, is basically to pull out the key insights, the real nuggets of knowledge from some frankly fascinating work. We're drawing on analysis from Robert D. Kaplan, who really brings these ideas into the modern day, but also looking back at, foundational thinkers.
People like Sir Halford John Mackinder, Alfred Thayer Mahan, Nicholas J. Spykman, and historians too, like William H. McNeill and Marshall Hodgson.
Exactly. So get ready for some, hopefully, aha moments about why, despite all our tech, the map is still just incredibly crucial.
And here's maybe the biggest takeaway right up front. In this world that feels so connected, so flat, the single most enduring thing, the force that really shapes history and conflict, isn't politics, not technology, maybe not even economics in the long run. It's simply where you are on the map.
Wow.
Everything else, it's fleeting, really. Geography, that
Yeah.
sticks around. As we'll see, it persists.
Okay, let's unpack that then. One thing that really jumped out from the sources is this idea that man-made borders, lines drawn on a map, if they don't match up with natural frontiers like mountains, they're just inherently vulnerable.
Yeah, unstable.
The DMZ, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, is such a stark example, isn't it? It's just this arbitrary line, no geographical logic, and it brutally slices an ethnic nation in half.
And history kind of backs this up. You look at the 20th century.
Right, like Germany, Vietnam, Yemen.
Yeah.
Places that were politically divided for ages, but eventually the forces pulling them together, culture, geography, maybe they won out.
Exactly. Which does make you wonder, doesn't it, about a future Greater Korea, where maybe that shared culture and geography just eventually overrides the politics.
It feels similar to the Berlin Wall coming down so suddenly.
Totally. Like the DMZ, it was just an artificial thing imposed on the landscape. And its fall wasn't just about, dictatorships being unstable. It was a big lesson in how the present, which always feels so solid and permanent, is actually really fleeting. And in times of chaos, the map suddenly becomes super important again, because it often holds the historical logic, the clues for what might happen next. It reminds you some things are just more fundamental.
So that flat world idea we kicked off with, it's really getting pushed back on by these deeper currents, historical and geographical.
Yeah, it's like one scholar put it, geography has been forgotten, not conquered.
That's a great line. And the period after 9/11 really highlighted this, didn't it? The whole experience, say, from Bosnia through to Iraq, it kind of exposed the limits of what some people call liberal universalism.
Right, that idea that democratic values are just plug and play, that you can easily transplant them anywhere, regardless of the local history or the actual ground conditions.
Yeah, and you saw America's intentions in the Near East, often good intentions, run smack into, well, the sources say, unmitigated havoc. Why? Because of those deep geographical realities they maybe didn't fully account for.
And that's the key insight, I think. Even with immense power, even with good intentions, if you ignore the geographic realities, you can end up with chaos you didn't expect. It really shows how geography gets its revenge when you forget about it.
Okay, so does technology cancel this out? I mean, jets, internet.
That's the plausible fallacy, as the sources put it. It sounds right, but no. Think about military logistics, just moving stuff around.
Right.
If you want continuous influence somewhere, you need boots on the ground, physical presence. And deploying troops, equipment, all that stuff across continents, it's incredibly, insanely expensive. And oceans, mountains, terrain, they still fundamentally limit what you can do.
Yeah, air power can bomb things.
Sure, it can bombard,
Okay.
but it can't move goods in bulk. It can't control territory day to day. You can't FedEx democracy, basically.
Oh, right. Okay, this tension then between these big ideals and the hard realities on the ground, it leads us nicely into this concept of Central Europe.
Ah,
In the 1980s, it was really more of an idea, wasn't it? An aspiration. It was a way to draw a line, politically and culturally, against the Soviet East, a kind of declaration of memory.
it definitely conjured up these images, didn't it? This deliciously cluttered and romantic European civilization. You think Austro-Hungarian Empire, classical music, humanism, that whole intellectual tradition.
Including its endangered Jewish communities, a really key part of that picture. It was imagined as this zone of tolerance, multi-ethnic economic progress.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and maybe a bit uncomfortable. Despite that noble ideal, Central Europe, well, it doesn't really exist on the relief map.
What do you mean?
Well, thinkers who focused on geography, the determinists, maybe like Mackinder again and James Fairgrieve, they saw this whole region as basically a crush zone.
A crush zone.
Yeah, this vulnerable strip squeezed between maritime Europe, the UK, France, Spain, looking out to the oceans, and the massive Eurasian heartland, Russia, focused inward on the continent. Strategically, they argued, there just isn't space for a stable, independent Central Europe. It gets squeezed.
Wow. Okay, and that connects to Germany's division during the Cold War, because the Berlin Wall was obviously artificial.
Yes, the wall itself was. But the actual division of Germany, east and west, maybe less artificial than we think. A geographer named Saul B. Cohen argued that line roughly followed a really ancient divide between old Frankish tribes in the west and Slavonic tribes in the east. So for Cohen, West Germany was basically part of maritime Europe, looking west. East Germany, that belonged to the continental land power realm, looking east.
So he actually thought a divided Germany was better, geopolitically.
Gotta argued it was geopolitically sound, yeah, because it stabilized that constant tension, that battle between maritime and heartland power, right there in the middle of Europe.
That is a sobering thought. So, following that logic, German reunification, it wasn't necessarily the happy rebirth of that idealistic Central Europe.
Maybe not. According to this line of thinking, it could actually reignite that old struggle for dominance over Europe and the heartland. The fundamental question pops right back up. Is Germany going to lean east towards Russia or west towards the UK and the US?
So reunification didn't solve the geographical problem, it just reset the board.
Kinda, yeah. It put Germany back in that pivotal, potentially unstable position.
Okay, so if geography is that strong a force, does it mean human agency, our choices, our ideals? Are they just, pointless? Are we just puppets of the map?
Well, no, that's taking it too far. The sources don't argue for complete fatalism, that idealistic longing for Central Europe, for example, that did drive things, like the humanitarian interventions in the Balkans in the 90s. The goal was to protect people, safeguard freedom.
Right, trying to push back against brutality.
Exactly. But those interventions also sort of bumped up against that unsettling underlying truth of geography. Atrocities happen, yes, but human rationality, our ability to reason and act, lets us struggle against injustice. The push to restore Central Europe was a powerful rallying cry, a call for using Western power responsibly.
Even if sometimes maybe it created an illusion of, painless victory from the air.
Right. The map dictates a lot, sets the stage, creates the pressures. But it doesn't dictate everything. Human choices still matter immensely within those constraints.
Which brings us squarely back to Sir Halford J. Mackinder. You mentioned him earlier, often called the father of modern geopolitics.
Yeah, his 1904 article, The Geographical Pivot of History, was hugely influential. Now, we have to acknowledge his ideas were sometimes twisted and misused later on.
Like the Nazis using them for Lebensraum, seeking living space.
Exactly. But despite that misuse, his core insights about how geography shapes power, they remain remarkably relevant even today.
And his big famous line, that grand and simplistic dictum, it really sticks with you.
It does. Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world.
Okay, let's break that down. The heartland, that's Central Asia, right? That vast inner core of Eurasia.
Precisely. Mackinder saw it as the pivot point, the geographical hinge on which world power rests. He thought the very layout of the earth, the natural arteries of movement, encourages the rise of big land empires there.
And Russia is the classic example.
The ultimate land-based empire, according to this view. Historically, it was constantly vulnerable to invasion think-Mongols because it lacked strong and natural barriers, just huge forests and plains.
So that led to this obsession.
A perennial obsession, yeah, with expanding, grabbing territory, creating buffer zones, dominating those contiguous shadow zones around its borders, just constantly seeking strategic depth.
And culturally being somewhat cut off from the European Renaissance.
That left it with perhaps deep feelings of insecurity, maybe even inferiority compared to the West, which also fueled that drive for territory and power.
And you can see Mackinder's ideas playing out in history. World War I, World War II, huge struggles over that heartland and the lands around it, the rimlands.
Absolutely. And the Cold War. That was basically the Soviet Union dominating Eastern Europe, controlling the gateway to the heartland, and the West trying to contain them using bases all around that rimland.
Even Afghanistan fits this picture, right? The Soviets went in partly seeking a warm water port on the Indian Ocean.
A classic sea power goal, ironically, for a land empire.
And they got bogged down, defeated by guerrillas fighting on their home turf in a rugged corner of that very heartland they sought to master. It helped break the empire.
It's a powerful example. And fast forward to today. Russia's ongoing efforts to, well, reconsolidate control or influence over that same area, Belarus, Ukraine, the Caucasus, Central Asia, that's still a central drama in world politics, isn't it? A full century after Mackinder.
It really is. But Mackinder wasn't just some rigid determinist, was he? You mentioned he evolved.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Mackinder, this supposed arch-realist, actually came to support Woodrow Wilson's ideas about national self-determination after World War I, specifically for Eastern Europe.
Why?
He saw a vital necessity for a buffer zone, a tier of independent states sitting between Germany and Russia. Why? To prevent either of those huge land powers from completely dominating the heartland. It was the only way, he thought, to give a spiritual and geopolitical Central Europe a real chance to exist.
So he saw independence there not just as idealism, but as a strategic necessity for stability.
Exactly. And he was remarkably prescient, predicting that new states would emerge there if or when the Russian Empire, later the Soviet Union, eventually weakened or collapsed, which of course happened.
Okay, so Mackinder is all about the landmass, the heartland. But there's another major thinker around the same time arguing almost the opposite, right? Focusing on the sea.
That's Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, slightly older than Mackinder. His big argument was that sea power wasn't just more important than land power, but actually less threatening to international stability.
How so? Less threatening?
Well, his point was that navies have a limited capacity to extend coercive force inland. They can blockade, they can project power along coasts, but they can't easily occupy vast territories like land armies can. So less of a direct menace to liberty, he argued.
Interesting. And for Mahan, the key areas weren't in Central Asia, but
The oceans, specifically the Indian and Pacific Oceans. He saw them as the hinges of geopolitical destiny. They allowed maritime nations like Britain then, or the U.S. later, to project power around the edges of Eurasia, that rimland, and even penetrate inland using rail and roads connected to ports.
and he saw Russia's weakness there.
Clearly, he espied Russia's vulnerability, as one source puts it. Its distance from warm water ports, especially the Indian Ocean, was a major strategic disadvantage, a source of its constant dissatisfaction and aggression trying to break out.
And the clash zone was.
Mahan identified that debatable ground in Asia, places like China, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, as the main arena where Russian land power would inevitably clash with British or other sea power.
Okay, so we have Mackinder's heartland, Mahan's sea power, and then Nicholas Spykman comes along and sort of synthesizes or updates this.
Yeah, Spykman really picked up on Mackinder, but put a much stronger emphasis on that rimland, the coastal areas ringing the heartland, particularly around the Indian and Pacific Oceans. He famously tweaked Mackinder's dictum to say something like, "Who controls the rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world."
So the edge is more important than the core for Spykman.
In many ways, yes, because it's where sea power and land power directly compete. And Spykman also had some really interesting things to say about the United States.
Which were?
He argued the U.S. became a great power not primarily because of its ideals or its system of government, but because of its amazing geographical position. It was the most favored state, with easy access to both the Atlantic and the Pacific, protected by oceans. He had that famous line, "History is made in the temperate latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere."
A bit of geographical bias there, maybe?
Perhaps. But his view of the world was pretty stark overall. He saw international society as basically anarchic, without a central authority to preserve law and order. States are just constantly struggling for survival, for self-preservation.
And moral values?
For Spykman, they were often just tools used to facilitate the attainment of power. Pretty bleak. He didn't believe in trying to dominate the world, though. He advocated for balanced power as the only real path to relative safety and stability.
And you can directly see how Spykman's ideas, combined with Mahan's, fed into the Cold War strategy of containment, right?
Absolutely. The whole strategy relied on alliances and bases in those crucial rimland nations around Eurasia, Western Europe, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Japan, South Korea, precisely to encircle the Soviet heartland and prevent its expansion. It's Spykman and Mahan in action.
Okay, fast forwarding again. Mackinder also talked about the world becoming a closed system, especially after World War I. What did he mean by that?
He meant that basically all the land on Earth had been claimed, politically mapped out, pegged out, as he put it. There were no more blank spaces, no new continents to discover or easily colonize. Eurasia and Africa together formed this massive, interconnected world island.
Containing most of the world's people, resources, wealth.
Exactly. And because it's a closed system, increasingly connected, things that happen in one part can ripple across the whole thing. Like harsh terrain in Afghanistan isn't just a local issue anymore. Its political effects can register across the entire world island. A local fight can have truly global consequences.
And technology and population growth, paradoxically, make geography more important, not less.
That's the argument. The shrinking of the map through tech, plus billions more people crowding onto it, makes Eurasia especially feel only more claustrophobic. Resources get scarcer, competition intensifies, friction points multiply.
This leads into Paul Bracken's concept of the second nuclear age. What's that about?
Bracken's point is that we've moved beyond the Cold War bipolar standoff. Now, especially in Eurasia, you have multiple states acquiring nuclear weapons or other highly disruptive technologies, maybe not as sophisticated as the superpowers, but still devastating. Poor man's nukes, he calls them.
And these act as equalizers.
Yeah, they kind of level the playing field, making the world less predictable, less Eurocentric or US-centric. It leads to this incredibly complex, dangerous situation of multidimensional brinkmanship.
Like a crowded chessboard where lots of players suddenly have queen-like powers.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
And the potential for catastrophic miscalculation is huge, especially with densely populated megacities being so vulnerable.
And Bracken also warns about underestimating nationalism.
Hugely. He says Western observers often miss how powerful nationalism still is. When you combine that fervent, sometimes resentful, hot-blooded nationalism with access to these destructive technologies, well, it's a dangerous mix. Missiles become the new totemic objects, symbols of national power and defiance.
Wow. And alongside this, you have states themselves weakening.
Yeah, globalization puts pressure on states, but so do internal things. Wars, refugee flows, cities growing too fast without infrastructure. This particularly hits states that were kind of artificially conceived in the first place, often by colonial powers drawing lines on maps.
Like Iraq, maybe,
Yeah.
Pakistan, Nigeria, Yemen, Somalia.
Those are key examples. Their borders don't always match ethnic or geographical realities, making them inherently fragile. And when the central state weakens, what fills the vacuum?
Non-state actors, militias.
Exactly. These terrain-specific sub-state land forces, as the sources call them, groups like Hezbollah or the Taliban, they often emerge from specific geographical areas. They know the terrain intimately, and they can fight better than state armies on the same territory ever could.
Because they're literally rooted in the geography. It shows the power of statelessness in a way.
Precisely. Geography empowers them against often cumbersome state machines.
Okay, let's make this even more concrete. Can we look at a few specific regions where these geographical principles really play out? Europe, for example.
Sure. Europe, even with the EU trying to unify things, still has this delicious complexity, doesn't it? All those seas, peninsulas, river valleys, mountain ranges, they naturally foster political and economic disunity. It's baked into the geography.
That coastline, 23,000 miles, same as the Earth's circumference. That's amazing.
Yeah, that incredibly deviating and shattered coastline, plus all the navigable rivers, it allowed for diverse cultures to develop relatively independently, but also close enough to interact and clash. It ensures Europe keeps generating headlines, keeps having complex power politics.
Okay, moving south and east, Iran. That seems like a country defined by its location.
Absolutely pivotal. Look at where it sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia. It's right at the juncture of major landmasses. Its geography basically dictates that it will play a major role in whatever trends sweep the region.
But the geography doesn't dictate what role, right?
Exactly. That's crucial. Geography sets the stage, but it can't determine the purpose for which Iran will be pivotal. That, the sources stress, is up to the decisions of men. You can point to moments in Iranian history, Nader Shah's conquests centuries ago, the fall of the Shah in 79, maybe even opportunities after 9/11 where different choices could have sent the country and the region down a very different path, despite its fixed geography.
Human agency striking back, or at least having its say. What about Iraq, another place where geography seems almost like a curse?
It's incredibly challenging geography, isn't it? Huge oil reserves, yes, but also a large, diverse population. It sits right at the fault line between the Sunni and Shiite worlds. And look where it is sort of equidistant between powerful neighbors like Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia. It's just stuck in the middle.
And those factors, plus the history of brutal rule.
It means whatever happens in Iraq, its political evolution cannot but affect the entire Arab world. And historically, its lack of strong natural borders often meant that only really repressive regimes felt they could hold the country together. So when that repression lifts, instability is almost built in.
And briefly, Turkey, another crossroads state.
Very much so. Just look at its neighbors: Greece, Bulgaria in Europe, Iran, Iraq, Syria in the Middle East, Azerbaijan in the Caucasus, plus those long Black Sea and Mediterranean coasts. It makes Turkey truly equidistant, as the sources say, between Europe, Russia, and the Middle East.
Which explains its often complex balancing act foreign policy.
Absolutely. It's constantly pulled in multiple directions by its geography. Its location profoundly shapes its view of the world and its security concerns.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, the big message seems to be, geography isn't dead, not by a long shot.
Not at all. It's not a relic. It's this active, persistent force. Understanding the relief map, the physical layout of the world, it's actually crucial if you want to understand the logic behind history and maybe get a glimpse of future political dynamics.
But it's not pure destiny either. Human choices, technology, they give us room to maneuver, right, within those geographical constraints.
Definitely. We live in this closed system now, where local stuff can echo globally, and there are contradictions everywhere. Geography matters immensely, but so does what we do about it.
So the final thought for you, the listener, comes back to this idea.
Yeah, the idea that by becoming more expert at reading the map, we can, helped by technology, stretch some of the limits the map inflicts. Think about what that means. Acknowledging geography's power doesn't have to be fatalistic. Instead, it can be a vital tool.
A tool for navigating this incredibly complex, crowded, interconnected, and let's face it, increasingly volatile world we live in. So the question for you is, how does getting this renewed sensibility about time and space, about the enduring power of the map, change your understanding, your view of the daily news, maybe even your own personal decisions? Something to think about.